You're listening to the Vint podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint podcast presented by Coravin. Coravin is the world leader in at-home wine preservation, allowing you to pour a glass of your favorite wine and enjoy more bottles in your cellar without having to pop the cork. And we're announcing that we've wrapped up our giveaway of Coravin Timeless Wine Preservation System. And the Vint podcast listener who will receive the Coravin is Chris H. from Ohio. Thanks for your episode suggestions, Chris, and we'll be in touch for delivery of your new Coravin. And as always, I'm joined by Billy Galanko, who is freshly married and back in the podcast saddle. How you doing, Billy?
Doing very well. Glad to be back for a new episode. We had a little bit of time off after the wedding to recharge, but we'll be doing our full, longer, celebratory trip coming this winter.
Nice, awesome. And you guys you did a little bit of wine tasting, had some wine at your wedding, sure. You went out with some friends doing some tasting, is that right?
Yeah. So the wines we had at our wedding, I think we talked about in the last episode. Mm-hmm. They're actually fantastic. I can't say enough about the Boulanger. It was RD 2008 Boulanger. I highly recommend that. And also the Radicon 3781. I always get these numbers mixed up. Ribolla from 2008 was absolutely amazing. I actually drank it. I didn't finish it all the first night. I drank it more the second night. And it was the depth and complexity there was crazy. I actually showed one of my buddies who's really into wine, and he was like, I've never had anything like this. I'm texting my wine guy right now. And I was like, nice. Wait, I'm not your wine guy? But yeah, I was like, cool. But he was amazed. So that was really cool. But yeah, we ended up doing a little bit of tasting. We actually did a throwback. So for those of you who may not have been listening that long, my now wife wasn't really into wine when we first met, but she is really into gardens and plants in general. So we went to the place where we first tasted together in Sonoma, which is actually pretty cool. They're one of the first wineries to go biodynamic. So that was cool. But I do have one story from there, which our listeners may find interesting. And it was that they had recently come out with a traditional method sparkling. And for anybody who is basically drinking traditional method sparkling in general, there's three really basic things you can look for to give you hints on what it's going to taste like. One is it vintage or non-vintage? So as many people know, a lot of the sparkling wine you'll taste, even traditional method, is a blend of many different vintages. And they're basically going to create a consistent house style. Of course, there's outliers like Krug, who make a distinct yearly release that's non-vintage. And those are amazing. I highly recommend those. They pull wines from 10 to 20 years and blend those together. So the first thing you want to look for is non-vintage or vintage. Second would be the blend. Like I said with Krug, it could be, they might list the blend of the years that the base wine came from or how it was treated. Sometimes it's in oak, sometimes it's 100% stainless or mixed. And you also want to look up the varieties. Typically, if for Champagne, it'll be Pinot Meunier or Meunier, Pinot Noir, and Chardonnay. In other regions, it'll vary. So those two tidbits will tell you a lot about what the wine is going to taste like. And then the last one, and for me, one of the most important, is the time on the lees. And for those who don't know, I think many of our listeners probably do, but the lees are the dead yeast cells that are in the bottle as the wine goes through a secondary fermentation. So they'll put the tirage in, they'll put a little bit of juice and yeast into the base wine to really get the fermentation started. They'll put the cap on, and that fermentation creates the bubbles in your traditional method sparkling. Once the yeast are done doing their job, then they die, they go to the bottom, and they start breaking down in a process called autolysis, which then gives you that amazing brioche, bready flavors that everybody loves, especially in Champagne. And the length of time that the wine spends in contact with those lees dictates the amount of breadiness that you might get. It's not like completely linear, and obviously styles change, so you can't bank on it, but a good rule of thumb is the more time on the lees, the more of that bready brioche characteristic you're going to get. I think baseline Champagne, I can't remember how long it is exactly out of bone up before I do my studies again. But I think it's about 18 months, give or take, I think is the minimum time on the lease. And it changes for vintage and other things. But so that's something that's really important to me. So they had a traditional method sparkling. It was a Blanc de Blanc. So I already knew the grapes that were in it. It was going to be 100% Chardonnay. I knew it was traditional method. So the only question left for me to know how this wine might taste was, and actually I found out later that it was barrel fermented too, because it was 2021 was the vintage on it. And I was like, it's 2024. So I asked the guy how long it was on the lees. I was like, oh, cool. Is this wine on the lees for 2.5, 3 years before it was disgorged? Turns out I had spent more time in barrel. The guy said it was 6 months on the lees. But then immediately after me asking that, he's like, you work in the industry, don't you? And I was like, yes, I do. And he's like, oh, would you like the industry discount? So I was like, oh, this guy's just being very nice. But soon after, so at my wedding, I'd just gotten done. We're in the reception saying hi to everyone. I run into some friends and they had gone tasting based on our recommendation. And one of my buddies had asked one of the workers in the tasting room, what are some annoying questions you get from people? And the first thing he says is how much we get all these people coming in trying to show off their wine knowledge and try to tell us without telling us that they're in the industry. So for example, this guy came in yesterday and asked how long this wine was on the lees. And he's like, who asked that? And then it was just like, and then my other buddy had just gone to a wine tasting with me where we tasted many champagnes. And I asked every single one of them how much time was on the lees for each wine. So he was like, was this guy happening to be with a wedding party and getting married soon? And the guy was like, yeah, how do you guys know? And he's like, it was my friend. So they all got a laugh. It turns out people are talking about me after I asked about the lees. I thought he was just being nice, but he was very friendly. But yeah.
You wouldn't have gotten the industry discount if you didn't show off your knowledge, but it comes at a cost.
I think a lot of our listeners will probably be nodding their heads. If you're coming across a traditional method sparkling, especially at a place that doesn't normally make sparkling, one of your first questions, if you know the grapes, is how long has it been on the lees? So
yeah.
Anyways, I was a little flabbergasted by that. It's all right. Like you said, I got the discount. It was nice. The tasting went well. So that's all that matters.
Yeah, I guess the only other thing, and this is, I don't know if it's in line with asking how much time on the lees, but just asking about sugar and dosage, that would maybe be number 4 added to the list.
Yeah.
But that's probably even, I don't know if that's more obscure than the lees thing. I don't think that either are super obscure, though, if you drink any amount of sparkling wine.
Yeah.
Like an enthusiast, right? So
for me, when you're looking at that, that's typically on the label. So it'll say Brut Nature, Extra Brut.
yeah, sure.
So typically I don't have to ask that. I think this one did state what it was at the time, but that's another one. I think that gets even more nerdy but that's maybe that's just me. But it's typically stated. But yeah, shifting gears a little bit, it was a great wedding. But today I want to get to our guest. We're going to Bordeaux today, and we're going to another producer. This is exciting because we had a left bank producer at Costa Tonel, and now we're going to the right bank and having Angelus on today, which was really exciting. But we have Yves De Launay, who is the executive vice president of the Americas from Angelus, on today to really tell us about the property, the history, kind of how the property has grown and changed over the years and the different wines that they make. A lot of the innovation that they've been doing both in the vineyards and in the winery. And it was a really great conversation. I learned a lot about why there's a big bell on their label and why their wine is some of the most prestigious coming out of the right bank and Saint-Émilion in general.
Yeah, it was a really cool conversation because the amount of knowledge and experience that Yves has across the industry and is able to, I don't know if he'll culminate his career at Angelus, but in the back half of his career after being at a ton of having a lot of really prestigious roles, is able to put into context everything that's happening at Angelus, and he had a lot of enthusiasm about it. I thought answered our questions in a lot of detail, such that if you're a fan of Bordeaux, if you're a fan of Angelus, if you're a fan of French wine and the history of the area in general, it's going to be an interesting interview. So yeah, it was a great talk.
Yeah. He gets into a lot of detail, and we didn't shy away from any questions. We asked them about they left the Saint-Émilion classification, or they
Mm-hmm.
decided not to reapply. We discussed that, which was really nice and interesting to hear firsthand. We talked about their owner, kind of like all her vision and how when she came in, I think she's 8th generation ownership, which is rare to see in Bordeaux in such a corporate environment. Rare to see these chateaux just passed down and kept in the family. So that was really cool to see how she's building on the legacy of her forefathers, as well as shaping Angelus for the future and making it her own. So I think I learned a lot. I own some of they have a prestige cuvee of 100% Cab Franc that they released just starting with the 2016 vintage called Hommage de Elisabeth Boucher. I always pronounce that wrong. Hommage à Elisabeth Boucher. Yes. And I own some of those bottles. I tried to corner the American market for a little while with those, just basically buying everything that was available when they first came out. Little did I think about is they keep bringing more in, even though there's only 1,000 bottles made. Yeah, so I was literally their target there. But I do own a handful of those, and I'm excited to drink them. And it was cool to talk to him about, because I've never met anybody who's actually tasted the wine before. So that was really neat.
Who's going to run out of money, or will Billy run out of money before Angelus runs out of wine? We'll see. Stay tuned.
There were only 1,000 bottles made, so I was like, cool. At one point, I had 10. I was like, I have 1% of all of the wine, all of the bottles in the world of this wine. It was fun. It still is fun. I still have them.
Yep. Very cool. Before we get to our interview with Yves, we have a word from Coravin. Always remember, if you're looking to drink more wine from your cellar without worrying about wasting what you can't consume, one of the Coravin systems, just like the one that we're giving away to Chris, will be your best friend. You can visit coravin.com and use code VINT15 for 15% off your purchase of one of their devices. If you're a member of the trade, visit trade.coravin.com for exclusive discounts on the range of products and accessories for work.
Hi, thanks so much for joining today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah,
Thank you to be here.
This is really exciting. I think we haven't really dug in much on the right bank of Bordeaux, so it's really nice to start or really get more detailed with one of the best and most esteemed chateaus on that side, Chateau Angélus. Could you maybe give us a little bit of background on yourself, and then we'll dive into the estate and everything that you guys are doing there?
Sure, wonderful. Thank you so much again for having me. I guess my background is really a mix of France, where I grew up, and the US, where I spent the last 25 years. I got involved very early in the wine industry, actually out of Raritan College, which I did in France, as I hold a master of agronomy, and I specialized quickly in viticulture and oenology. So that was really the start for me of my passion, first of all, and then I developed my career in the wine industry. So very briefly, in the last 25 years that I've been working in the US, I've been fortunate to manage some of the finest and most luxurious actually products, mostly in wine and spirits, but not only. So I manage brands such as Saint Laurent, Cartier, Louis XIII Cognac, Krug, Dom Perignon, some chateaux in Bordeaux like Chateau Cheval Blanc and Chateau d'Yquem, and many more. It was quite a lot of fun, and more recently I had the privilege also of leading the private client team of Moet Hennessy, and recently also served as the head of wines for Sotheby's. So that's in a nutshell my background in the last 25 years.
Wow, it's quite the route there. So how did you transition from your latest role at Sotheby's over to what you're doing now? And can you explain a little bit about what your primary role is right now?
Sure. So I'm responsible for Chateau Angélus for the areas of the Americas, and I was quite attracted by Chateau Angélus in many different ways. I would say first, both by the product and the people, which has always been for me the reason my choices when I chose to a certain job. The product, obviously, because of the wine itself, its quality, its style, its reputation, its constant search for excellence, which I knew. And in fact, that ultimately every other product I've been working with in my career, it's what we call in French, produit d'exception. So an exceptional product. So clearly that's always, for me, I need to have a connection with the product that I'm working with or the brand I'm working with. But more importantly, it's really the people behind the brands. And that's really what makes a big difference. And in that case, more specifically, Stéphanie Debois, who is the owner of Château Angélus. And what happened is an ex-colleague of mine put us in touch a bit over a year ago now. And she was looking for someone to manage the Americas for Château Angélus. When Stéphanie shared her vision with me, I immediately got seduced, convinced by what she was explaining to me and what she wanted to do, her vision. And we started to exchange on what the roadmap could look like for the Americas. So we then met at the chateau. I went there, and we quickly realized, in fact, that we were totally aligned on how we would make really the bells of Angelus ring a little bit more loud in the US and the rest of the Americas. And that's how it started. And it's been now almost a year, and it's been quite enjoyable, and a lot of progress has been made, and it's quite smooth as well.
A question that just, I guess, maybe shows my ignorance about the brand itself, but are there any chateau that the group who owns Angelus has here in the U.S. as well? Are there any U.S.-based estates that are underneath the brand at all?
Yeah, Chateau Angélus is actually, there are not too many chateaux who currently have a representation in the US. There are probably 5 or 6, I think that's it. So it's really not that many. It's obviously an investment. And we're definitely the only chateau who has actually 2-person full-time based in the US. So a strong representation, and really showing the determination of Stéphanie to make an impact on this important market, which is the US market.
Yeah, I sort of came to mind because you were mentioning your background in all these other luxury segments, watches, bags, these kinds of things, which all have physical footprints in the US. And it just came to mind that I don't know of many wine estates who have a physical footprint in the US as well to access the market.
Very, very limited, in fact, and if not part of a larger group. And in fact, we created a subsidiary, Angelus Americas, to really have a stronger foothold here and be able to establish our presence in a longer term.
Can you share a little bit? I guess this is a perfect kind of jumping in point. Maybe we can fill Brady in a little bit too on a little bit about the history of Angelus. Number one, where it's like iconic bell came from, and then we can talk about the wine offerings too, not just the core Grand Vin, but you guys have the Hommage Elisabeth Boucher that came out not too long ago. I actually own some of that. I'd love to get into the different bottlings as well.
You're lucky. One of the happy few to have one of these bottles of Hommage Elisabeth Boucher, and we'll talk about it in a second. But first, to answer your question about the history of, actually, it's quite. There are 2 things. First of all, it's, as I was mentioning, it's one of the rare Grand Cru which is still family owned, and that's happened after almost 250 years. So today, Stéphanie Debois is the one managing the chateau, after she took over from her father, Hubert, in 2012. And she's, in fact, the 8th generation and the 3rd woman actually running the estates. So that's quite a long legacy. And what she has accomplished actually in the last 12 years is quite remarkable. And how she's built from this legacy that she inherited from the 7 previous generation is quite remarkable. So in these 12 years, and it's even more remarkable that her father really has done a lot to improve the quality and make Angelus what it is today in terms of quality and reputation. So it was not necessarily easy for her take it to another level. But she did. She she about tripled the size actually of the vineyards by acquiring new vineyards. She built new cellars in Carrillon first, and now for Angelus. She's also expanded in hospitality with 2 Michelin star restaurants, one in Bordeaux, one in Saint-Émilion, and also acquired hotels in Saint-Émilion. And last but not least, she also acquired a farm of about 9 hectares, really building a true ecosystem around the name of Angelus, and always with this quest for excellence in mind. When she arrived, there was about 30 people working for the chateau, for Angelus. As of today, we are about 130 different people working in the different activities that exist. So quite a big expansion, a big milestone as well. In the meantime, her father, as I was mentioning, was very involved and recognized for his skills and talent as a winemaker, wine grower, as he likes to describe himself. He's still very active, in fact. I was with him a couple of weeks ago in California. This year, he will be making his 40th vintage at Angelus. It really shows the longevity and the constant improvement that he has been bringing to the chateau. Now, you mentioned the bell specifically, and what's the kind of the history behind the name Angelus. So the name Angelus actually was a prayer. It was a prayer that dates from the 15th century, 1456 exactly. It was a prayer which was ordered by the Pope at the time. And it was a prayer that was supposed to be said 3 times a day, at 7 o'clock in the morning, at noon, and at 7 o'clock in the evening. And to make sure that the Christians would pray at those times, all the bells of the Christendom were ringing from the different churches. When you are at Chateau Angélus, when you are in the vineyards, you are actually in the vineyard is a natural amphitheater. And you are surrounded by 3 different villages. And obviously all these villages each of these villages has a church. And so you can hear these bells ringing. You could hear these bells ringing at the same time when you were in the vineyards, and the workers at the time had to stop doing what they were doing, and they were supposed to pray. And that's the reason. This vineyard was called, a plot specifically in the middle of the vineyard was called the Clos de l'Angélus, and then it became Angelus. That's where the name is coming from, and that's also why on our labels, on all our labels, we do have these bells. Now, the last part of your question was about the wine and some of the wine that we have. So obviously, the first one is the flagship Angelus, our Grand Vin, which has built the reputation of the chateau. It's a unique style because it has a fairly high proportion of Cabernet Franc. Pretty much half of the vineyard is currently Cabernet Franc. Sometimes in the blend, we have a little bit more than half of the blend, and that's a wine obviously which has beautiful balance, and the balance actually really between the structure and the power, but also a lot of elegance, which is important, keeping some freshness, some tension, and which has the ability to age for a long time. And that's really the signature of the Cabernet, of the Cabernet Franc. Hommage à Elisabeth Boucher is actually, which you describe, and you said you are a lucky owner of one of these bottles. It's actually a very tiny production. It's produced only in a few exceptional vintages. The first one was actually 2016, and it's made from, so it's 100% Cabernet Franc. There's no Merlot in the blend. It's less usually than 1,000 bottles. It's around 1,000 bottles, let's say, and it's with vines which are quite old. On average, they're between 60 to 80 years old. It's a remarkable wine, obviously very much sought after and very difficult to find, with very strong allocation. So that's a super interesting wine, and I was lucky enough to test a bottle a couple of weeks ago, actually in California with Hubert, very generous owner opened a bottle of the 2016 precisely, and it was absolutely beautiful already. Super elegant, very fresh, and quite smooth. The other wine I think which is worth mentioning, the two other wines I think which are worth mentioning are Carillon. Carillon is known as our second wine, but actually one of the first things that Stephanie did when she arrived is she didn't like the concept of second wine. Quite often in Bordeaux, the second wine was, the philosophy behind the second wine was what was not good enough or considered or judged good enough for the Grand Vin was repurposed for the second wine. She didn't like this notion. And so what she decided to do is to produce a wine that would have a very distinct identity, a wine with its own personality. And so the first thing she did is she separated the vineyards of Angelus and the vineyard of Carillon. Carillon has its own vineyard. It's a very different kind of grape varietals on these vineyards. I was mentioning half of the vineyards pretty much is Cabernet Franc for Angelus. For Carillon, we have, it usually the blend is about 80 to 90% Merlot and only 10 to 20% Cabernet Franc. Totally different style of wine, very different personality. Also, what she did is she built a different cellar for Carillon, which, so all the wines from Carillon, all the Carillon wines since 2019 are done in this new cellar, which is quite high technology, very sustainable as well. And so the aging is also quite different. There's a bit less wood in it. There's part of it which is aged in stainless steel. So the entire concept behind Carillon is to make a wine which is very, which is more approachable, a wine which you can enjoy a bit sooner, a wine which has a very nice complexity, but also a lot of purity of the fruits, and it's quite distinct, as I was mentioning, from Angelus. And the last one that you mentioned is actually Tempo, which is actually interesting as well. Tempo is a wine that Stephanie created with some vineyard that she acquired in the Côte de Castillon. Côte de Castillon is about 15 minutes from Côte de Castillon and Côte de Franc, both actually. It's about 15 minutes from Saint-Émilion. And it's a wine which is, the aim of this wine is really to give an access to the world of Angelus, or what a great wine can be. Is to demystify really the approach of the great wine. Ultimately, that's what it is. It is mostly Merlot, also based on a great terroir, mostly clay and a bit of limestone as well. And it is a one which has no aging in wood. It's a non-pretentious wine. It's a one that you can enjoy anytime with friends every day. At a very affordable price level. Usually, it retails for between $25 to $30. And that's the access that you can of your world of Angelus without thinking too much and still having very pleasurable wine. So I think these four wines, Angelus, Hommage à Elisabeth Boucher, Carillon, and Tempo are interesting. We also make other wines, more especially some white wines and other wines. But these four wines are quite interesting and by themselves.
You talked a little bit about the varying the differences in the sort of style and approach, especially with the Carillon versus the Grand Vin, the fresher qualities, maybe more fruit forward and approachable profile. Do you see that as sort of a movement across the estate and across the region as well? Not just, I know you're trying to draw distinctions between those particular wines and the styles, but do you see that happening across estates, across the region?
Yes, I certainly believe so. I believe the style of the wine in Bordeaux has been evolving recently in order to be able to enjoy them sooner, have wines a bit less tannic, have a bit more fruits and more tension than more tannins, more especially from the wood. I was mentioning this balance between the structure, the power, and the elegance and the finesse. And clearly, Angelus has been working in that direction as well, leaning more towards the ones which have elegance. The Cabernet Franc definitely brings that characteristic. Stephanie, actually, although Hubert has been making the wine for a long time, Stephanie also has been involved in the winemaking. She's been working alongside her father and to bring nuances. It's not drastic changes, but to bring nuances. For instance, it's what she calls little pixel. That's a pixelization of the wine. So it's not drastic changes, but to make sure that we bring this tension, we bring this finesse, and we bring a bit of freshness to the wines, and ultimately we can enjoy them sooner. Right now, if you test 2016, 2015, 2018, the wine are already quite enjoyable. Obviously, they have a long life ahead of them, but you can already, with proper decanting, have a great experience with these wines. And there are ways that have been brought to the, more especially in the cellars, to allow this characteristic of a bit more smoothness and elegance to happen. More specifically in the aging and the wood that we use, the cask that we use, all of that actually has a big impact with different casks for the different grapes. For the Cabernet Franc, part of it actually is aged in what we call the foudre. Foudre is actually a very large cask, which is about 30 hectoliters. It's not cask, actually. It's a barrel of about 30 hectoliters. It allows more aromatic expression, more oxygenation, a bit less tannin from the woods. It's a bit more grainy and finer tannins. And that really brings this elegance and avoid the Cabernet Franc is very sensitive to the wood. So it really allows to Cabernet Franc to express what it can in terms of aromatic expression and finesse.
So the main difference between the different wood is just generally the size. Or are you guys sourcing? I know you might have just mentioned it here. The tighter grain.
Sometimes the barrel also suppliers different. They use separate wood, and so we don't use the same wood for the Merlot. For some of the Merlot, each plot is vinified. Everything is vinified plot by plot.
Yep.
And so based on the characteristic of that, the team is adjusting and selecting a specific barrel or a specific wood, specific barrel, specific producer. And sometimes a larger, for the Cabernet Franc specifically, some larger barrel like the foudre.
Yep, cool. Yeah, we could go down a deep rabbit hole on barrels and toast levels, but I guess one last high level question, just because I like to nerd out on some of these: is it mostly all French wood from different forests, or are you pulling in like some Slavonian oak or anything like that?
100% French wood. Yeah,
cool. So I had a question. Transitioning back a little bit, you mentioned sustainability. Something I've loosely been thinking about, but haven't really asked anybody from the region or working with wines from the region, is as climate change tends to be pushing things a little hotter in general, do you think the soils in the right bank with a little bit more clay are better positioned to kind of transition than maybe some of the really high gravel soils on the left bank that may heat up a little faster?
Yeah. We have two types of soil, and when you look at the vineyards of Angelus, we have on the hills we have the Merlot, and typically there the soil is actually clay, the blue clay, which is very famous, more especially in our neighbors in the Pomerol. So that's the soil that we have in for more specifically for the Merlot, and you're right, this is cold, and that helps keeping freshness to the grapes. We have the limestone for the Cabernet Franc, the foot of the hills, but that's actually not a problem because the Cabernet Franc is not as sensitive to the heat as the Merlot can be in terms of concentration and alcoholic concentration, and sugar concentration. But it's true that what's behind it is obviously all the climate change that we have been experiencing, and I would not say global warming. Global warming takes very different expressions depending where you are. I think on the Mediterranean, global warming translates into a lot of heat and drought and high temperature. In the Atlantic, it's a bit different. It's a bit more sometimes violent conditions that we experience at different time. It can be frost, it can be hail. We can have heat waves as well. It can be drought, like we had in 2022. Or on the contrary, it can be very heavy rain. What's important to keep in mind, I think, with the climate change is it doesn't necessarily affect the wine itself, or it doesn't directly affect the wine itself. it affects obviously sometimes the production. And we do have tools sometimes to mitigate these violent conditions. For instance, like a couple of months ago when we were during the primeur in Bordeaux, there was a lot of frost. Every night there was some frost risk and threats. So typically that's something we can combat. We have wind turbines. In part of the vineyards, we also have candles that we can lit. And so by having this action, we, allow to not have any impact from the frost typically on the production overall quantity that's being produced. Another violent condition that we recently actually happened 2 weeks ago in Bordeaux is hail that we see sometimes more frequently. And same for hail, we have also ways to fight against the hail. We have balloons that we have where, without being too technical, but these balloons you send them. They have salt inside the balloons. You send them in the air in the clouds, and then the salt actually when they explode, the salt absorb all the humidity and transform the ice into rain. But I would say that the vine is also like it's almost like a human being. If you are healthy, you can fight and you can recover better from disease. If you are weak, on the contrary, it will affect you more. We saw that during COVID. Some people resist better than others, for the COVID. The wines are a bit the same. If you have strong vines, and in our case, it's a strong asset for us because it's the vines that we have are on average about 40 years old. I was mentioning we have some vines on Cabernet Franc specifically can be 60, 80, 100 years old. Some of the oldest one in Saint-Émilion, in fact. And it means that they have a very deep root system, and so they can adapt. And so we do have to adapt in the vineyard. The team has to adapt in the vineyard. It requires a lot of action from them. But the vine also adapt. And if there's too much drought, for instance, or if it's too hot, it can really get the system the root system is quite deep, and it can get the elements and the water deeper in the ground. So that's something which is for us a big asset. Another thing also, on this climate change and the condition that we sometimes have, like some big rains. That was the case actually in 2023. We had 40 different storms, over 40 different storms in Saint-Émilion in 2023. Obviously, it can be quite a problem because it can bring disease in the vineyards. We are somewhat lucky with our terroir, and I was mentioning the amphitheaters. So the topography that we have when we have a violent rain, it means that all the rains, 80% pretty much of the rains that happen drains to the bottom of the hill. And so it doesn't affect as much the vine, the root system. And obviously that's a big plus that we have with our terroir over there. So sorry, it's a long answer to your question.
No, that's great. Oh, go ahead, Brady.
Yeah, I talk to a lot of folks who are customers of ours and clients that we work with, and a lot of them mention and are concerned about some of the things that you're mentioning with regards to production and how, effects of climate change and weather elements might affect production in the regions that they're most interested in, and how that ultimately affects pricing for them as the end consumer. What effect? You mentioned navigating some of the storms in 2023 and other effects. Have you seen much changes in your ability to produce high quality wines at volume and at scale in those years? And do you expect there to be decreases in total volume produced because of some of these effects over the coming years? It's hard to say.
Not necessarily, because the team is obviously very active, probably even more active than it was like a few decades ago. In the vineyards, we have a large team in a large viticulture team in both viticulture and oenology. So they're quite active. And the approach, generally speaking, of the team is we are sure of nothing. Because each vintage is different. Each vintage brings its lots of unexpected conditions, with the exception of 2015, where everything was happening exactly the way you hope it would happen. So when it's like that, it's great. But obviously, that becomes really an exception. So of course we know the terroir, we know the varietals, but the team always need to adapt. And what's important really is to keep in mind is that 90% of the winemaking is actually happening in a vineyard. The fundamental rule, and that's what Hubert keeps saying all the time, is to make a good wine, you need to have healthy grapes. That's you cannot make a good wine without healthy grapes. So that means that people have to be in the vineyard pretty much every day, manage the quantity of the leaves, the foliage, the quantity of grapes, adapt depending on the weather. If it is not enough sun, we need to reduce the grapes. If we have too much sun, on the contrary, we need to have a bit less leaves, so some deleafing happening in the vineyards. That's the experience of the team, which really allow to end up with grapes that are healthy and allow to produce a good wine. And then obviously in the cellars, I was mentioning, we vinify plot by plot. We use different tanks, barrels, and in order to also influence the balance and the aromatic expression of the wines. That all of that also happening to make sure that to ensure that we have a wine with a certain quality and a certain style as well.
Awesome. So we don't need to go too much into it, but I have to ask about your guys' decision to leave the classification in Saint-Émilion. Mm-hmm. Can you give us just like a quick overview of why that decision was made and how you guys feel it's best for you guys moving forward?
Sure. No, not a problem. Angelus actually has been occupied all the different steps of the classification, from Grand Cru Classé, Grand Cru Classé B, Grand Cru Classé A in 2012, which correspond actually when Stephanie arrived. It has been a great framework to push us to continue to develop on the quality of the wine and the style of the wine, and it was quite stimulating, environment. I think the chateau now wants to free, and it's a decision of Stephanie and along with her father, in fact, to free themselves of a frame which can be constraining sometimes, with some criteria that don't necessarily are the one that we are looking as the primary criteria. And so she decided to exit the classification, or actually not present our wines for the classification in 2022. And in order to keep this freedom, and for instance, that allowed to to include some of the plots that were acquired from Chateau Bellevue. It also allowed to remove some of the plots that we had. But what is sure is ultimately there is always, and even more actually, this quest for excellence and for our wines, and the classification was a stimulating framework, and now we want to go further, and that's what motivated the decision of Stephanie to exit the classification alongside actually a few other chateaux, as you know.
On that same note, now that I don't think maybe some of our listeners might know, but yeah, the classification system does require certain requirements for hospitality services, and there's a lot of things that don't necessarily relate to winemaking. So I think it's interesting for some people to dig into it a little bit more and realize that the decision is more broad than just a name or something on a vineyard.
No, very true. It's true that the priority for Angelus at the chateau is to make the most beautiful wine, and that's really what we're looking for, and that's the most important for us, and that's how we built. Obviously, that's how the reputation of the chateau has been built on that quality.
Exactly. Yeah. I'd love to look forward now a little bit. Can you tell us a little things about? Are there going to be any more special kind of like the Hommage, the Elisabeth coming out, or are you guys? I guess what is coming on the pipeline for Angelus in the future here, and what can we expect to be able to access in the U.S.? And then also on the same lines, maybe describe a little bit about what it's like to visit Angelus if anybody wants to go and stop by when they're in Bordeaux.
Yeah, what you can look forward to at Angelus is our 2022 vintage, which actually we just presented a couple of weeks ago in New York. We call it the Majestic. And so the 2022 vintage obviously corresponds also to the vintage and the year that Angelus decided not to be part of the classification anymore. It will be an exceptional vintage. I was mentioning we had drought and everything, but it turned out to be like it will be an exceptional vintage with an amazing level of harmony and balance. It already has some great complexity. It's a lot of purity, a lot of aromas. It will be available beginning of next year on the market. Actually, that's going to be quite interesting because this vintage also marked the beginning of a new cycle, the cycle being 10 years. And it's going to be quite a symbolic years, also 10 years after Stephanie joined. And what she did in 2012, she had a unique presentation for the 2012 bottle, which was on gold on the black with no label. Here again, she came up with a unique presentation with a bottle that will not have a label, but it will be inspired by high jewelry with an enamel, 20 karat gold, mother of pearl, and a design which is inspired by the planet and the astral revolution, symbolizing the new cycle and the old cycle and the new one. So something to look for coming up soon. There'll be kind of collector to have like 2012, and the wine will be presented that way actually for every sizes, from 750 milliliter, so from the regular bottle, to the Primat, which is 27 liter. Quite a spectacular presentation, which we revealed last week in 2 weeks ago. In New York, and that's been very well received already. So on a wine, that's definitely something to look for. In terms of visit, we don't have that many visits, but we do host, obviously. So it's really by appointment only. It's our friends and the family, I guess, and some of our trade partners. But we love to host these Angelus lovers. One thing actually to look for also in the coming year, I would say, is some recent project and development that has happened at the chateau. I was mentioning that we redid the cellars of Carillon, which started to be effective in 2019, and same with the Angelus. So we are planning to launch next year a new kind of pendular winery with a cone-shaped inverted vats, a little bit like what we have at Carillon. So the vats are going to be suspended from the ceiling. So quite different, as you can imagine. Instead of walking the cellars and having the vats on both sides of the alley, usually that's what you have. Here you're going to have to look at the ceiling, and all the vats will be suspended. Not only is it going to be aesthetic, but the reason also is the force of gravity. So we can now empty these vats without the needs of pumps. That allows to preserve the grapes. It's softer, so preserve also the oxidation and the reduction actually of the grapes, and that allows us to really work with a bit more precision, but also attention, and still with some craftsmanship, but a bit more precision in the way we're going to make the wine. So the work has been going on for 2 years now. So if you go to the chateau, you will see right now you have a crane, but in next year the work will be completed, and we look forward to having this new cellar, which is going to be aesthetic, but also quite obviously in terms of technology and to produce great wines, something that we're really excited about.
That's awesome. Yeah, that sounds. If you're saying they're conical, they're going to be like cones, so then they look in easy emptying as well. That'll be really, that'll be really cool.
Yves De Launay was actually the first one to test this technology in Bordeaux. He did it at La Fleur de Bois, one of his other chateaux, and then Carillon, and then now a few chateaux have already adopted this technology. But it's quite in terms of it's very different, obviously, from everything that was done before. And in terms of production of the wine, and it really allows this more aromatic expression, which we want.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much for your time today. I think that's a great place to leave it. I think everybody should look for those. Those bottles look really cool. I was actually just looking up the 2022s right now. And the other beauty is you can You can't necessarily always go visit the chateau itself. Driving by, the beauty of Saint-Émilion is you can see the vineyards. I've seen the bell outside, so you can just go and take a picture and then try the wines right where they are. So thank you so much, Yves, for joining us today.
Thank you, Billy, and thank you, Brady. Thank you very much again for having me.
All right, that was our interview with Yves De Launay of Angelus. I hope everybody learned more about that storied property, and they will buy a bottle, and then they'll match that perfect bottle every time with Coravin. You can elevate any dining experience, ensuring each pour complements any meal or moment spent with friends. So whether you're having a wedding, just like I had, or you're just having friends over for an evening on a weekend, grab a Coravin so that way you can pair any wine to match their interests, their palate, and any meal you're serving at that time. That is our episode for this week, and we'll be back with another episode next week. Cheers.